want to thank for use of this facility, the Nelson Mullins Law Firm. We really appreciate being able to enjoy this view while we talk about the future of work, the digital economy, how to get economic growth more broadly shared. And one of the companies that has been at the forefront of changing the way all of us do whatever it is we do every single day has been really involved in helping us put this together. And we have from Google, Lee Carosi-Dunn, who's a good friend, and she's the head of White House outreach at Google. She worked on the Hill for many years, and it's critical that we have people who understand the way that government works or doesn't work at the companies that are on the forefront of innovation. Google is certainly thinking about all these issues, and to introduce our next panel, please welcome Lee Dunn. Thanks, Lee.
Thanks, Jimmy. While I speak, I'll invite the panelists to come up. Next, we're going to have Secretary Acosta and Dan Bryant from Walmart and Senator Ben Sasse. So Google is an IA member, and I am really happy to be able to have the privilege to introduce the next panel. Not only because I really appreciate all the work that Secretary Acosta is doing to help our workforce, and as well as Senator Sasse, but Google has a strategic partnership with Walmart, and Dan and I were just talking about it. So Google partnered with Walmart earlier this year using two products we have. One is Google Shopping Express. It's not deployed in every state, everywhere yet, but it is here in the DC area. So instead of spending as much time as I do driving back and forth to Walmart to buy more diapers, more baby food, more toys, more milk, more bread, now I can go online anywhere I want, hopefully on the soccer field where I am with my kids, and order all that milk, bread, toilet paper. I know Senator Sasse has 3 kids, so I know you know what I mean, right? Yeah, a lot of toilet paper, a lot of diapers in our days, right? And so, this is where technology really is great, and this is where a partnership between a brick and mortar retailer like Walmart and a technology company like Google really comes into play. And Dan and I are really proud of it because we believe that we're saving Americans time, we're giving them better quality of life, and they're still getting the great products that they want from Walmart, and Google's enabling that. The second Google tool that we use to partner with Walmart is Google Home. And so I think a lot of you have heard about these new devices. Amazon has Alexa, Google has Google Home, where you can be there and say, man, I have 0 diapers left for my child. Google Home, please order more diapers from Walmart, and they're delivered. So again, sometimes you don't even have to go to the computer. You can speak to the computer, and magically diapers and everything else is delivered to you courtesy of Walmart. So Dan and I are really proud to help sponsor this panel and this discussion, but we're really proud of the partnership between our two companies because it shows the new technology and the brick and mortar coming together to serve Americans' needs and give them better quality of life. So thanks, Dan. I kick it off to you.
Wonderful. Thank you. A big thank you to Jimmy Kemp and the Kemp Forum team for convening this discussion today. Jimmy, I hope that you and the forum never grow tired of talking about opportunity-oriented public policy and making that agenda lively and relevant as you do so well. So thank you. We may have a Senate vote coming up before too long, so we're going to move fast. It is a delight, though, to introduce two distinguished leaders in our national life, Senator Ben Sasse and Secretary Alex Acosta. I'm privileged to have been a colleague of both of these outstanding leaders many, many years ago. Very briefly, let me just introduce them. As you probably know, Senator Sasse has a doctorate in American history. He served for a period of time as a management consultant. He was part of the leadership team in the Office of Legal Policy at the Justice Department in Bush 43. He was
also known as Dan Bryant's chief of staff, but whatever.
This is true. He was also a chief of staff in the House of Representatives. He was then the assistant secretary for policy at HHS. He was president of Midland University, a small university in his hometown of Fremont, Nebraska, a university which, like many such educational institutions, is under distress. He came in and really presided over a remarkable turnaround at this institution, a period of growth and a variety of really exciting performance indicators under Ben's leadership. He is now the senator from Nebraska and, more importantly, a best-selling author. If you haven't yet read, more importantly, bought his book, The Vanishing American Adult, please do so. It's a remarkable book that's really been a catalyst for important conversation. Secretary Acosta, a successful attorney in private practice at Kirkland & Ellis before he became a board member of the National Labor Relations Board. He was the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights in the Bush 43 administration. He also served as United States Attorney for the Southern District of Florida. He then also pivoted to the Academy and served as Dean of the Florida International University Law School. Again, a remarkable tenure, turning around and really helping to elevate that educational institution. He was also chairman of a local bank where, again, he was involved in really helping to strengthen a crucial local institution. He is now the Secretary of Labor. Secretary Acosta, Senator Sasse, thank you.
Thanks for having us. Thank you.
So this future of work, digital economy conversation is very well timed, as all of you know. It feels like you can't walk 2 steps and not bump into this issue and hear discussion and debate about this issue. What I did want to do, though, from the outset was to ask both the Senator and the Secretary to help put this in context. This is not the first moment where we can foresee ourselves moving into epical changes that will have upsides and downsides and that will have any number of disruptive effects. This isn't the first such moment. Senator, can you help place this moment as we think about where we're going in a historical context related to prior sweeping changes that affected the economy and society?
Yeah, that's fun. So first of all, good to be here. Thanks for moderating. Thanks to Google. I think we're here mostly because we love Jimmy Kemp and the Kemp Forum's focus on opportunity. But I think this panel also originated out of the fact that the 3 of us were having pizza a couple months ago. And Alex and I realized that we agree on a bunch of things and we differ on some things. And Dan said, let's take this on the road. So I will say, I think this city is always presentist. And it's sort of always obsessed with what can we accomplish in the next 6 months or 24 months in the legislative agenda. And one of the reasons why I think the city's often not very effective at thinking about near-term policy is because we don't have a historical context. So thanks for giving me this pitch. I think if we do the epical history, I think you've only had 4 kinds of economies in the history of the world, right? You had hunter-gatherers, you had agrarianism, not like Nebraska farming today, which is high-tech, but 10,000 years ago until 150 years ago, you didn't have job change in these kinds of worlds. You didn't have job choice. If you're a hunter-gatherer or if you're a farmer from the beginning of time until 150 years ago, you have just becoming 8 or 10 or 12 years old and doing more of what mom and dad do or what grandma and grandpa do. You don't have specialization. Now Alex is presiding over a world where hyper-specialization is going to change. You know, every 24 months, people have to rethink, does their job still exist in a decade? And so I think the only way to anchor this moment is by thinking about industrialization. So I'm going to come back to this, let Alex set the stage as well. But I think the analog for this moment is the moment of the end of the agrarian era and the rise of urbanization and industrialization, where job choice came into being and specialization. Now we have hyper job choice, hyper specialization, which is going to happen multiple times in the course of a lifetime, and that's completely new in human history. So I think the analog to this is the industrial era and the progressive response to that, and we don't have the historical categories to anchor this moment yet in the same way.
Very helpful. Secretary.
So let me echo the thank you. It's wonderful to be here and to sort of take this discussion on the road. We actually started the discussion and didn't finish over dinner, and so great opportunity. Let me sort of pick up where Ben left off and sort of finish what I think is the thought. And so we have had change throughout human history, but the rate of change is so much faster today than it ever was. And if you sort of look, to go from the hunter-gatherer to industrial, it took how long? To go from industrial to sort of what we call modern took a little bit, less time. And as we progress, we're seeing change happening faster and faster. And so let me throw out some examples. The iPhone. How old's the iPhone? Any ideas? Someone really young in the audience, back there. How old's the iPhone? When was it invented? Have you ever been without an iPhone? Okay. So how long was it invented? Actually, about 10 years ago, right? We think of the iPhone as sort of, part of us almost, or some kind of a high-tech phone, yet it's relatively new. Uber, Lyft, Airbnb, these are all new inventions. They didn't exist before, so look at how much has been transformed in just under a decade. And if you sort of spin that out, whether it's a new economy or not, we can debate what's the definition of new, but something that I don't think we can debate is it is an age of accelerating change where each cycle of change comes faster and faster and faster. And so we need to think ahead if we're going to be ready. We need to have lifelong learners. And let me sort of touch on that, because as you have job choice and as the jobs change, the workforce needs to be ready to change with that. But the one point that I would caution is, as we talk about lifelong learning, it's important to understand that lifelong learning and lifelong earning are not exclusive. And so we need to teach skills at the same time that we teach the ability to learn. And that is something that I think it's important to circle back to, because that is something that I think we're losing as we're focusing just on how quickly things change. Let's not focus on the fear of future change, but let's focus on what skills we need today as well.
Briefly, before we jump forward, thinking about this upskilling requirement, anything to learn from the transition from the industrial age to the information age. It happened iteratively, it was complex, but it happened. As we look back on that from the perspective of an historian, anything to learn as we now know we're on the cusp of this accelerating change, a change that is, to the Secretary's point, already underway. Any quick lessons to be learned?
Yeah, I mean, I think the anchor of human identity is, your family, your friends, your sort of worldview. Do you have a theological or philosophical framework to make sense of death and suffering? And do you have work that matters? Sort of, a number of us were at the AEI event last night, and Arthur Brooks talks all the time about meaningful work as one of the core drivers of human happiness. And it isn't, do I think I make enough money? Do I think at the end of the day my ankles or knees hurt, or that there's some annoying person 3 cubicles away who talks too loudly? Am I satisfied with the experience of my work all day, every day? But do I think my work matters? Am I needed in the world? And if those are kind of core anchors, it turns out that work anchors a lot of the other ones. Family structures are kind of derivative on work. Your local community is clearly derivative on work. And so I think the big analog to kind of 1870 to 1900 or 1920 was this last moment of disruption where work, again, when you were hunter-gatherers, even though you were mobile, you took your 4th and your 6th cousins with you. There was community that traveled with you. When you were in an agrarian village in New England during the colonial period, or Nebraska after the Homestead Act in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, your work defined the place where your community was anchored. What happened with the disruption of people leaving the countryside and moving to cities, both push and pull factors. So 86% of Americans live and work on the farm during the Civil War. 60% live and work in cities by World War II. That disruption is transformational. It happens inside 70 years. People thought America won't work when you move to cities because you're going to have a disruption, not just of your work, but of your community, and there's going to be anonymity. Your word won't matter. You won't have dense relationships anymore. There'll be all this anonymity which will destroy community. And for a while, that is what it looked like. Like, maybe nobody in this room is going to defend prohibition as a policy, but we got prohibition because there really were drunk 15-year-old Irish kids everywhere in the streets of Baltimore and Philly and Boston and New York. There was the sense that anonymity was going to destroy community, and we had to figure out how to build new forms of social capital, and it happened in cities. But it just took a number of decades before you figured out what it looked like to have the density of community in urban ethnic neighborhoods. I think a huge part of what we're going through right now is we're hollowing out these local institutions as we go from mostly urban living to mostly suburban, ex-urban living, and work for the first time might not be the anchor of the home place. Obviously, our work and our home are separated in the factory era, but you still live near the factory. What's happening now as job duration gets shorter and shorter and community gets disrupted is people have less social support networks to think about how they get to meaningful work again. And now you're going to have to do that when you're 40 and 45 and 50. That's never happened before in human history. So to Alex's point about getting to a place where you think about reskilling and uptraining, that's happening at a moment where your local community network is also being disrupted. And so I think we need bigger categories to understand we're going to need new social capital and communal density again, but we don't know where that's going to come from. And so I think we're going to need to have sort of multi-decade thinking about what it looks like to find work that's new to somebody who's mid-career, which is a new thing, even as their local networks and support structures and community are disrupted.
Let me, if I could, take a slightly different tact. And we were at the same dinner last night, and Rabbi Sachs had I think it was he who raised a really interesting point, which is that Facebook has now changed their corporate motto from connecting people to creating communities. And on the one hand, I do agree that our communities are being disrupted, but on the other hand, we have a real interesting opportunity now to use technology and other modern mechanisms to create these communities. And one of the challenges that we saw as we moved from industrial to information age is we had enough time for our government institutions to keep pace and to adjust the rules of the road. But what we're seeing now is we're seeing the demand for different working modalities change, but we're not seeing government keeping pace. And so most of our labor law is organized around a very traditional lifelong relationship between employer and employee. Well, less and less that defines the typical relationship. And for the younger folks in the room, you're going to have probably a dozen different employers as you go throughout your life. More and more we're seeing individuals working in a gig economy where they may have multiple jobs or they may work from home. And so on the one hand, how do you create communities around that? And going to Ben's point, that needs to happen. If we're going to have a cohesive social compact as a nation, we need to figure out ways to create communities. And technology can be used to do that, not just to connect people, but to create communities. And there is a difference between having 200 Facebook friends and having 200 Facebook friends that you can really embrace that are there for you, right? But at the same time, government has an obligation to keep pace and to re-examine the rules that are used to regulate those employer-employee relationships that then impact on the ability of individuals to work in a modern system that can help create those communities. And I think one of the challenges is, can our institutions keep pace with the pace of change in the private sector?
Let me go there. Before we do, what's the average number of friends that someone has today, Senator Sasse, compared to 10 years or 20 years ago?
Yeah, so there's a lot of literature on loneliness as an epidemic. You have a bunch of public health folks who now define loneliness as the #1 health problem in America. The average American in 1990 had about 3.2 friends. I mean this not as Facebook friends or Senate friends, my good friend from the state of X that I'm about to eviscerate in a debate. Like an actual Aristotelian friend, somebody that when they're happy, you're happy. When they hurt, you hurt. The way we love our kids, right? When my teenage daughter's hurt, I don't choose to hurt, I just hurt because I love them.
You don't have to define what Aristotelian friend is. We all know that.
Well, when you say you have 3, after Alex just mentioned 200 Facebook friends or 200 Facebook friends, the average American had 3.2 friends in 1990, 1.8 today. A halving of friendship in under 30 years. There's a rapid, massive hollowing out of a sense that people have anybody they can count on in a time of crisis. 40% of American adults say they have 0 confidants, 0 people that they talk about anything important with. That's devastating.
And so as we head into this period of disruption and downsizing and reskilling and so much change, it feels in many ways like the social capital that is required to help you manage through those transitions may itself be depleted. Let me ask, Secretary, following up on a comment you just made, how can government, federal, state, local, how can it, working within their own spheres of competence and together, help minimize the downsides and maximize the upsides of this future of work economy?
So, I think government needs to take a serious look at what work looks like today and what it will look like in the future. And let's just mention, gig economy. Lots of folks talk about that. There is a very in-depth study currently underway at BLS within the Labor Department to try to quantify the gig economy. In '95, it was a certain size. In about 2005, it hadn't grown much, to the surprise of some, but we haven't really done an in-depth study in 10 years. And I don't know what the results are, but I'm going to predict that from 2005 to today, we've had a massive change in the percentage of our economy that can be defined loosely as so-called gig. And so have we re-examined our laws and our rules to incorporate that? And as the results of that study come out next summer, what are we going to do as an institution of government, both on the executive and on the legislative side, to say, when do we modernize the rules that govern the workplace? If individuals want to work in a gig style, are we going to accommodate that, or are we going to fight it? And that is something that is sometimes hard, I think, getting legislation done. Takes a lot of hard work and takes some amount of time. But I would argue that it's something that in the long run we really need to do, because these laws need to change. No one thinks that today's economy is the way it looked in the 60s. Yet much of the rules of the road were set back in the 60s, and they need to be updated.
Or the 50s, 40s, or 30s, Senator.
I want to underscore that point. So Alex has done a really important bit of work trying to nudge not just the executive branch and the rulemaking and regulatory processes, but the oversight and legislative committees in the House and the Senate to start thinking about this era of gig economy, or more broadly, the portable, mobile economy with this more rapid set of changes. And we are trying to run most of these social economic policies on a 1965 chassis. And nobody works in the same way. Average duration at a firm in the 1970s was 2.5 decades. Average duration at a firm today is 4 years and change, right? So when you think about healthcare, when we have our healthcare debates, we tend to have big and important debates about level of government subsidy and federal versus state regulation, but very little of the conversation is talking about the number one driver of uninsurance in America, which is job change. When you ask the American people, why are there more uninsured people 30 years ago to 20 years ago, 20 years ago to 10 years ago, they say two things. They think there are either pre-existing health conditions, we have more sick people, or it's socioeconomic status, we have more poor people. Neither of those things are true. We have more uninsurance in America primarily because we've had more job change, and if you have your employer be the basis of where you get your health insurance, then if you change jobs every 4 years, you have a 4 to 6 month period of uninsurance at the moment of job change. Well, that ends up meaning that 1/8 of the time you're uninsured. Well, that's when you get the breast cancer diagnosis. That's when you have the car accident, and now you become the pre-existing conditions population of 10 and 20 years from now. And so we need health insurance, I would argue more catastrophic than trying to have first dollar for everything, trying to sort of launder regular healthcare expenditures through an insurance marketplace, which we don't do in any other sector. We don't try to insure against the routine, but set that political debate aside. Simply the question of whether or not you have portability in your policies is one of the biggest drivers of uninsurance. And the last big social economic policy change in America was 30 years ago when we fixed this problem for retirement. Right? It used to be that the assumption was you were going to have one employer for your life and you were going to have a defined benefit plan. And in the late 1980s, we switched to a world where you have tax-protected 401ks that are portable across job and geographic change, because you're going to aggregate contributions from lots of employers over the course of a lifetime. So we've sort of figured it out on pensions, and that was the last big updating we did, and it's 30 years ago. Alex is trying to drive lots of those conversations in other places than just pensions right now.
So in addition to modernizing in key areas of policy and law, it feels like we'll do that and it will already be potentially outmoded. It will be outdated. It feels like we need a political policy business framework that embraces the premise that we all have to be nimble in continuing to innovate as this pace of change continues to accelerate. What might that political, policy, business framework with nimbleness built in as a premise look like?
And so let me come at it from an unusual angle. The private sector is nimble because it has to be nimble. If you are not nimble, someone else will be. And as Google or Walmart will discover in a few years, someone else can come in if you're not nimble and stay ahead of the curve. Government.
There have been a few others that have come in the last couple of years.
Yeah. Government has less pressure to be nimble. And so one solution to nimbleness is to allow, for government to set frameworks, but then to allow individuals out in America to do what they do best, which is to decide what is best for themselves and their family and adjust as conditions adjust. And so let me give you an example in a different context, which is education. The traditional model of education is you go to school and then you go to work. In this changing time, is that the right model? Or do we need to allow for you work, school, work, school, work, school, or simultaneous work and school? And so we're talking in the administration about apprenticeships and industry-recognized apprenticeships. And the key to there is earn while you learn. You can be working as a pharmacy tech and learning to be a pharmacist, both simultaneous with your employer working in partnership with the college so that you get the education that you need to progress within your career, and you're upskilling your career both for your personal benefit, for the benefit of your employer as well, and the employer is supporting that. That's a very different view of education, but an education that brings all the partners into it. One of the challenges is, are our educational institutions accustomed to that? Can they be nimble enough to break the traditional framework and adopt that? Another challenge is, are government institutions nimble enough? And so all throughout one idea, we have all these benefits. 529 plans, for example, are one benefit, where so many in this audience are probably saving for your kids' education through 529 plans. Do those provide enough choice and nimbleness to adjust to this growing economy? So we, I would argue, as a government, need to recognize the importance of individual choice in charting one's path going forward, because individuals are going to be more nimble than government.
Senator, a nimble public-private framework.
I would stay at education first, which is that we have a higher education model that is still kind of one size fits all, in that every degree program is 4 years. Most schools aren't differentiating based on price, by degree type, by discipline that you're studying, by whether or not this is a liberal arts background or whether or not you're doing a pre-professional degree. We need lots more pluralization in this space, right? So secondary education became a mass institution during industrialization. So at the Civil War, end of Civil War, less than 2% of Americans are high school graduates. By 1940, 78% of Americans are high school graduates. Today, it's low 80s. So it hasn't really changed in the last 75 years. But in the previous 75 years, when you left the farm and moved to the city, institutionalizing the basic awake hour experiences of 14 to 18-year-olds became the mass experience. We're now drifting to a place where we act like a mass experience of 18 to 22, usually 23, 24-year-olds. The average time to degree at most big state universities now is pushing 5.5 years. You're only getting a 4-year degree. You're just paying for 5.5 years because the institutions are so lethargic. There's so little competition. But we're acting like it's a normal thing to treat every 18 to 20-something the same, and they're going to do this full-time, and later they're going to go work, and they'll work till the end of their days. Neither of those things are true. So we need lots more pluralization of higher ed. Some of that needs to come from the policy side, but the reality is you're probably only going to get it if the private sector, in terms of employers and lots of social enterprise, venture capital, venture philanthropy entrepreneurs, things like what the Khan Academy is doing, disrupt this model by looking at new opportunities that consider hybridization and differentiated place, because you're not doing a full-time 18 to 22-year-old for everybody in a way that's very effective.
And let me put some numbers around that. I was in a state recently, and I was speaking to some educators. And this is a state that's doing incredibly well. Among the large states, it is number 2 in the nation. And in advance of that, I like to look at stats, and so I pulled up the stats. And as I said, number 2 in the nation, so doing really well, right? 67% of students that entered college graduated within 6 years. How many of you in the audience would have expected a graduation rate of 6 years of 67%? And that's number 2 in the nation for a state university system. Now, of those 67%, let's call it 2/3 to make my math easy in a second, how many had a job that paid $25,000 or more within a year? And that was a really good stat, too. It was 66%. So 2/3 times 2/3 is 4/9, right? And so less than...
Hold on, checking it.
He's the PhD.
In math.
Less than half the students that started college graduated within 6 years and had a job that paid $25,000 or more. And that is a successful state college system, right? So what do we really call success in higher education? And so I think a really interesting thought experiment is ask yourself, whatever state you're from, do you know how many students go to your state university? And I bet you many of you do. Do you know how many graduate? Very few of you will know that figure. Do you know how many of you have jobs? How many of those had jobs? And I bet you very, very few in the audience or anyone who might be watching know that figure. So are we holding our educational systems accountable for output or input? Are we judging them by what's your enrollment and what's your fundraising figure? Or are we judging them by, are you graduating students that get jobs? And which matters more? How many people you can get through the door or how many people get out and hold jobs? And I think that that's a very basic question that we need to ask as we look at our educational institutions, and are they preparing this generation for the future?
Thank you. Unfortunately, we have Ben for 2 more minutes. He has a vote. He has to run. Any last comments? And if you would, Senator, we talk about community colleges, vocational education. You referenced 18 to 22. You even referenced high school. Any quick final thought about the imperative of innovation actually working its way down into high school as we think about upskilling, different kinds of skilling, and future of work?
Yeah, I mean, I'll make a brief comment, not to ride a hobby horse, but on adolescence as it's done in America right now. We are not thinking enough as a people about what is great about adolescence, but what the risks are of perpetual, endless adolescence. So adolescence is a category that's really only about 2 millennia old, and it's this idea that, but pre a concept of adolescence, there were dependent children and independent adults, and in every way you hit this marker where you transition from childhood to adult, and you were supposed to become an adult in every way. So you hit puberty used to come at 14, 15. Now in most sort of first world nations it comes at 12 or 13. But it used to be you got to be 14, 15, and your body went from being a kid to being an adult, and you didn't have certainty that your storehouses would hold enough grain for a bad harvest year or a bad winter, and you had some tribe next door that wanted to go to war, and so you got an adult body. You got to become an adult. You got to fight for us. You got to work full time. You got to leave school. You have to pretend you're morally fully formed. For those of us who have teenagers at home, who thinks your 18-year-old son has a frontal lobe that's fully done bacon yet, and he's ready to make every decision on his own with enough self-restraint and self-discipline and self-control? And you acted like you went from childhood to adulthood, and this switch flipped, and you're now an adult, and you get married, you procreate, you form an independent household, you school leave, you work full time, etc. Adolescence was this new idea that perhaps for 18 months to 4 years we would create a greenhouse phase, and we'd say, hey, maybe not every marker of going from childhood to adulthood happens at the same time just because you hit puberty. And so we created this protective space. You went to school a little bit longer. You didn't have to work full time yet. You didn't necessarily form a new household and start procreating. Lots of great things happened because we created a little bit of I'm usually a skeptic of safe spaces, but it's kind of nice for 13-year-olds to have a little bit of safe space and not be pushed entirely out of the nest. What we're doing now as the richest people at any time and place in human history is we've stopped to think about adolescence as a means to an end. And we've started to think about it as an end in itself, like maybe the destiny is to be forever young as a 15-year-old. That's a terrible idea, not just for our kids, but for civilization. And so Peter Pan, Disney has tried to remake it as a utopia, like you just get to stay in Neverland. If you go back and read the original Peter Pan, it's a dystopian hell. Like, this guy is a murderer. He's got an adult body and he's out there killing people, but he has no moral sense and no historical memory, and he doesn't remember what he did yesterday. Right now, it's increasingly difficult to tell our 10 and our 15 and our 20 and 25-year-olds apart. And if you drop somebody in from a time machine in human history past, they wouldn't be able to make any sense of that. That 18 to 24-year-old males, pushing half of our college-aged males, spend half of their waking hours playing video games. Like, I'm not meaning to sort of beat somebody up for 1 month poorly spent with a Tetris addiction in 1991. We've been there. But the idea that you would sort of think it's normal to think of consumption categories instead of production categories as the way you spend your teen years, as opposed to this being a means to an end. And so I think we want to see a lot more pluralization of higher ed. And then we want to see the demands of that, like helping our kids achieve bigger and better and long-term durable character that's going to be able to navigate 40 and 45 and 50-year-old disruptions. If we think about how to spend the time of 18 to 22-year-olds, it should make us rethink 18 and 17 and 16 a little bit. So I'd like to see a mass pluralization, maybe mass is the wrong word, broad diversification of higher ed institutions, and then I'd like to see that crowd down into secondary ed to pluralize that a bit more as well. I'm sorry that I have to vote, but we need good judges on the court, not super legislators. We need judges. So I got to flee.
Would you join me in thanking Senator Sasse? Thankfully, Alex has the decency to stay for the full time. We do have the secretary for 5 more minutes. Great discussion. I think we ought to invite the secretary and the senator back together. Jimmy, hopefully here. You could see the two of you really having a role to play in helping us think deeply about these issues. Mr. Secretary, let me ask the same question to you. As you think about experimentation and innovation, you noted this just a moment ago in education, what might that look like pushing down into high school?
First, let me once again agree with the importance to have a pluralization in the education system. But as we think about that, I think it's important to think how we talk about education and approach it. And so I talked about the emphasis on output as opposed to input. And let me be clear. The research mission of universities is important and is critical and has given us our competitive advantage as a nation. But that should not come to the exclusion of the education mission of universities, right? And so you can have some that focus on A, some that focus on B, some that focus on both research and education. And you can have a fair amount of diversity. I think it's also important to talk about what we mean by education. So I relayed the story of one state and the statistics around one state. Let me relay an experience I had in another state. I was speaking with the vice chancellor of that state school system, and I was talking about how we're not teaching practical skills, that we're just focused on theory, and how we're not preparing a vast number of students for the working world. And he said, Mr. Secretary, you're absolutely right. We have been focusing far too much on the AP and the IB courses. And so we are telling our high schools in preparation for college to focus much more on SAT prep and ACT prep. And I kind of looked at him and I'm like, I think you just proved my point, right? The vast majority of jobs are not determined by these prep courses, right? Yet one of the other issues out there is as we talk about education, we tend to talk about education in a very narrow way. We tend to talk about preparation for selective colleges, not preparation for life. And if those are the metrics that we judge our high schools by, then it's no surprise that our high schools focus on selective students, and that our high schools focus only on those courses that prepare, not only, but more heavily on those courses that prepare those selective students for selective admissions to selective colleges. And in the process, you're ignoring a whole lot of folks that need preparation for life. And so if you look and you do surveys, early on, kids love to learn. And then we start losing them, and we start losing them, and we start losing them, and you start seeing dropout rates. And how much of that is on the student versus on us for emphasizing the wrong things, for not working to connect what students are learning with life skills. So I was in Pennsylvania recently, and I was at a training facility, an education facility for carpenters. And they had a math book, and it was math for carpentry. And they're learning real math, and it works, but it connects math to a life skill. Mm-hmm. You know, are we thinking about teaching math in the context of life skills that lead to jobs? Or are we thinking of teaching math in the context of theory for an SAT test? And I think that's one of the challenges that we have now with our education system. What is the purpose of education? To prepare someone for life, or to prepare someone for a high-stakes test that leads to admission to a selective college? And if it's the latter, you just ignored a large, I would argue, more than a majority of our population.
Before we go to you for any closing comments, Mr. Secretary, a quick case study, a criminal justice major and police academy. Say more.
So this is a story I like to tell. I knew a young man who wanted to be a police officer. And he was advised to go to college and major in criminal justice, which is great. And so he took several years, he took out loans, he graduated in criminal justice, and then he went on to be a security guard. Because at no point was he given the practical skills of policing. So here's a question. How many in the audience ever participated in a study abroad? Okay, so I'd say about half, almost half. You know, colleges give credit for study abroad. If you can give credit for a study abroad, and you can give credit for what they have now as a study at sea, where you spend a semester on a cruise ship going to different ports and seeing parts of the nation, why can't you give credit for a semester at the police academy? Right? You learn rigorous skills at a police academy. You learn the rules of policing. You learn how to be a police officer, which is a life skill. You learn discipline. I would argue you learn, you know, at least as much as you do a study abroad. And wouldn't it be interesting to see higher education embracing sort of life education by recognizing that one can get credit for things like spending a semester at police academy? Because what you then have is a young man who wants to be a police officer becoming a lifelong learner by getting an education, but also becoming a lifelong earner by becoming a police officer. And that, to me, is what education's about.
Last question, Mr. Secretary. Are you more optimistic or pessimistic as you think about this world of AI, machine learning, automation?
So I figured I'd get the question and came prepared. Yesterday, Bureau of Labor Statistics released a study. 11.5 million jobs estimated in the next 10 years. So I have a list here of job growth. And you've got one industry sector, 754,000 jobs. The next industry sector, 580,000 jobs. Registered nurses, 437,000 new jobs. Home health aides, 425,000. Software developers, 253,000. I can go on and on. Medical assistants, 184,000. Waiters and waitresses, 182,000. Nursing assistants, 164,000. Construction, 153,000. Mm-hmm. So one, we're creating jobs, and that's great. Two, we have job openings in the economy right now. We have 6.1 million open jobs. Our issue is not job creation. We're creating jobs at a record pace, 1.1 million new jobs simply since January. Our issue is how do we fill those open jobs? Are our educational institutions providing the skills that the workplace is demanding? And so I guess I'll close with this. Early on, when I became secretary, I went to the G20 Conference of Labor Ministers. The number one issue among the G20 labor ministers was the skills gap. Every nation there spent the majority of their time talking about the gap between the skills being taught by higher education or by high schools and the skills demanded of the workplace. So I would say the challenge, and this is why I'm optimistic, the hard part is job creation, but that is happening. The easier part should be working with educational institutions so that they actually teach the skills that are demanded, so that the focus is on how do we help the student become not just a lifelong learner, but a lifelong earner. And so if we get that right, we're going to be an amazing, amazing nation with a great future.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Please join me in thanking Alex.
Thank you.
Jimmy.
So, Secretary, it's really a privilege to have you. We're grateful for what you've done in the private sector and now in the administration. One of the things that we want to always remind people is that public service is a high calling.